Hello all. This week our first lecture is going to be on the Great Depression. There's been a lot of news coverage in the past 5 years that's referred to the Great Depression. What was the Great Depression? When did it occur? And what was its impact? The Great Depression, or the Depression of 1929, began with the stock market crash of 1929. There were 13 to 15 million workers affected. Factories laid idle, banks were closed, family homes and farms were lost, and it was 12 years of deprivation, which is an extremely long, intense depression. Roaring 20s were not necessarily a period of affluence for everyone. The point I want to make here is that most people picture The Great Gatsby, for those of you who have read the book or seen the movie or both. It's, pictured as a time of money and affluence and parties and flappers, and the reality was not that for most working families. Families needed about $2,000 a year for basic necessities. 21% of families had less than $1,000 a year. 60% of Americans below $2,000. 40% of Americans had not enough reserves to draw on if they had no income. So I'm sure you've heard the term living paycheck to paycheck, and that's clearly what most of these people were doing. They had little to no savings and couldn't even always afford to actually sustain themselves. Unemployment was at 4% of the civilian forces in 1929 and at 25% unemployed in 1933, which was the worst year of the Depression. It blurred the distinction between the worthy and unworthy poor. Initial relief was handled by local private agencies, but much like we talked about in the Depression of 1893, quickly with the Depression as it spreads, you're going to find that the local agencies were not enough. They could not handle the overwhelming need. It was no longer limited to the sick, elderly, children, or lower class. Middle-class people who had worked their entire lives were without food, shelter, and jobs. Between 1929 and 1932, a third of the private industries just disappeared due to lack of funds. As many of you know, the President Herbert Hoover was president in 1929. His previous history of providing poor relief post-World War I, Europe, flood relief in Mississippi in 1927. He did not admit to the seriousness of the economic situation. And you're going to go back to the idea of laissez-faire. You're going to go back to this idea that the economy needs to right itself, and that's definitely a lot of people believed that. That was pretty widespread belief. He was convinced the economy was sound and would correct itself, and he very much believed in the idea of laissez-faire, which I've talked about in a previous lecture. He implemented the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, providing emergency finances to financial institutions. Families were left the emergency, local, and private agencies. He had really outdated beliefs. He still believed in the idea of American self-help. He viewed relief as a moral matter, not an economic one. He supported private charity but opposed public aid. He opposed federal aid, would delay the natural forces at work to restore prosperity, impaired the credit and solvency of the government. It stifled the voluntary giving, inflexible and could not respond to local needs. It established political bureaucracies, and it undermined free enterprise. It was a legal violation of a local responsibility and states' rights, and he really believed it threatened democracy. His attitude towards public relief in 1930 approved congressional appropriation of $45 million to feed stricken livestock in Arkansas, but opposed additional $25 million to feed starving farm families because they would be demoralized. He declared $2.6 billion federal public works programs dangerous. The New York model was a more aggressive approach that ran counter to Hoover. It was led by Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 1931, the state legislature provided unemployment relief to jobless citizens, placed unemployment in the same category as old age, widowhood, and industrial accidents, argued people had been paying taxes, so they should benefit. State Unemployment Relief Act, or the WICS Act. It was the first state to provide unemployment relief. Millions of dollars in aid extended to localities on a matching basis for work and home relief. The significance, it helped establish the constructive social value of adequate public relief. It helped break down the beliefs that such aid pauperized and demoralized its recipients. It changed the setting within which social workers function, needed trained professionals to deal with such massive numbers of individuals, and it was replicated in 24 states, and it became a prototype for the later federal programs. Okay, and then the last slide I'm going to talk about today is Bonus City. World War I veterans had sought compensation in the form of a bonus to balance the earnings of workers in the U.S. Who were soldiers in Europe. 1924, over Coolidge's veto, instated an adjustment compensation certificate to be paid in 1945. Veterans who lost their jobs during the Depression sought early payment of the veterans bonus. They didn't want to wait until 1945. They were out of jobs and starving now. The bill was passed in 1931 over Hoover's veto to allow veterans to borrow up to 50% of the bonus. But destitute veterans were not satisfied. About 17,000 veterans marched on Washington in 1932. Some took up residence in a shanty town, and that was called Bonus City. The Senate defeated the bonus bill, so many disappointed veterans returned home. Several thousand remained along with wives and children in really unsanitary conditions. There was a small group of radicals remained because it became an excuse for President Hoover to call in the military troops. The army arrived with guns, tanks, and tear gas to rout out the veterans who had worn the same uniform. 2 bonus marchers were killed and several others were injured. The Bonus City fiasco, breadlines, and utter despair led to the election of FDR. Right, so this is my reference slide for this on the Great Depression. Some of you may be wanting to look at unemployment and other issues that become really central during the Great Depression, or veterans' rights and how that's evolved over time. Thanks, guys.